There's a moment every football fan knows. You're scrolling through your phone on a Tuesday morning in July, and you see the notification. Your best player, gone. And the fee sounds massive. 60 million, 80 million, maybe more. And for about 48 hours, you're quietly devastated, but you tell yourself, okay, that's a lot of money. Surely we're going to do something serious with it. Surely this is the moment everything changes. And then the window closes, and you've signed a left back on loan and a 22-year-old from the Belgian second division that nobody has ever heard of. And the 60 million has seemingly vanished into thin air. Where did it go? That is exactly what we're going to answer today. I'm Chris, and I'm on a mission to make passionate sports fans like you just 1% more informed. Because the truth about why your club keeps selling its best players and what actually happens to that money is a lot more complicated, a lot more structural, and honestly a lot more uncomfortable than most football coverage ever gets into. Before we get into where the money goes, though, we need to talk about why the sale happened in the first place. Because it's rarely as simple as the club wanting to cash in. There are forces at work behind most big sales that have nothing to do with ambition or lack of it. And once you understand those forces, the whole thing starts to make a different kind of sense. Let's start with the most important concept in modern football finance that most fans still don't fully understand: profit and sustainability rules. In England, the Premier League operates under what are called PSR regulations. The basic principle is straightforward. A club cannot lose more than £105 million across a rolling 3-year period. If they do, they face points deductions, transfer embargoes, or in extreme cases, expulsion from the competition. Now, that sounds reasonable enough on the surface. But here's where it starts to get interesting. The way clubs account for player sales under PSR is very different to how fans think about them. When your club signs a player for £40 million on a 5-year contract, that $40 million is not hit as a single cost in year one. It gets spread, amortized, across the length of the contract. So it's $8 million per year on the books. That's manageable. That's something a football club can absorb. But wages are different. Wages are a cash cost every single week. They don't get spread across 5 years. They land on the books in real time. And that distinction between amortized transfer fees and real-time wage costs is at the heart of why selling clubs sell. Think about it this way. You have a player. He came through the academy. His book value, the amortized cost on your accounts, is close to zero because you developed him yourself. But he's now your best player and he wants wages that reflect that. $200,000 a week, maybe more. That wage bill lands on your financial accounts in full every single year. It doesn't get spread. It doesn't get softened. It just sits there, pushing you closer and closer to your PSR limit. Now, a club from the top half of the Premier League, or from Spain or Germany, comes in with a £60 million offer, and suddenly the maths looks very different. You book $60 million in profit on your accounts because your book value on that player was near zero. That $60 million gives you PSR headroom, real, meaningful headroom. Headroom you can use to absorb other costs, extend other contracts, or make signings that would otherwise have pushed you over the limit. This is not a conspiracy. This is not mismanagement. This is the financial architecture of modern football, working exactly as it was designed. And it has created a very deliberate two-tier economy in European football that I want to talk about now, because this is the part that explains everything. There are buying clubs and there are selling clubs, and the line between them is not drawn by ambition. It's drawn by financial structure. Buying clubs, your Real Madrids, your Manchester Cities, your PSGs, have revenue bases so large that they can absorb elite wages without it destroying their PSR position. They have commercial revenue, broadcast revenue, and matchday income at a scale that selling clubs simply cannot compete with. Manchester City generated over £800 million in revenue in their last reported financial year. That gives them room to carry enormous wage bills without breaching sustainability rules. Selling clubs operate on a completely different model. Their revenue is smaller. Their wage ratio, the percentage of total revenue spent on wages, is already high. And so when a top player demands top player wages, the club faces a binary choice: pay the wages and risk breaching PSR, or sell the player, bank the profit, and use the headroom to stay compliant. Porto are the textbook example of this model, working at its most deliberate. Over the last decade, Porto have sold Ruben Neves, Fabio Vieira, Otavio, Luis Diaz, and Pepe Escobar, among many others. Each time, the football media frames it as Porto losing their best players. But Porto's board would frame it entirely differently. They are operating a scouting and development machine that finds, develops, and sells elite talent at a profit. That profit funds the next cycle, and the cycle keeps going. Ajax did the same thing for decades. Feyenoord, Celtic, Southampton at their best Atletico Madrid before their Champions League money started arriving. These clubs are not failing. They have built a financially sustainable model around the reality of their market position. The question is just whether their fans understand that or not, and most of the time, they don't. So let's come back to your club, and let's talk about where the money actually goes. Because even when fans accept the sale, the follow-up frustration is always the same. What did we spend it on? Why don't we look any stronger? There are a few answers to this, and none of them are particularly satisfying. The first is debt. A significant number of football clubs carry structured debt, loans taken out to fund stadium development, training ground construction, or previous transfer activity. When a big sale comes in, a portion of that money, sometimes a very large portion, goes straight to servicing that debt. It doesn't buy a replacement. It doesn't go into the transfer kitty. It reduces a liability on the balance sheet that most fans don't even know exists. Everton are an interesting case study here. For years, Everton fans watched player sales happen and wondered where the investment went. The answer, in large part, was stadium financing. The cost of building a new ground at Bramley Moor Dock was enormous. Transfer activity became partially constrained by the financial commitments already made elsewhere. The money from player sales was never going to produce a like-for-like replacement. It was going to reduce exposure on a much larger financial commitment. The second destination for that money is wages, not new wages, existing wages. There are clubs right now in the Premier League whose wage bills are so stretched that a significant chunk of every transfer receipt goes to simply keeping the lights on, covering the payroll, meeting contractual obligations to players who are no longer even at the club, loan deals, contract buyouts, residual payments. It is completely invisible to fans, but it is completely real on the balance sheet. The third answer, and this is the one that stings the most, is that the replacement does exist. You just haven't heard of them yet. Selling clubs have become extremely good at identifying the next player before the current one leaves. The scout is already in Romania or Brazil or the Scottish Premiership. The deal is already half done, and the player who arrives for $8 million will be sold for $50 million in 3 years' time. That is the model. That is the plan. Fans just experience it as a downgrade because they're comparing a finished product to a raw one. Southampton are the most cited example of this in recent English football history. The production line they ran between roughly 2012 and 2018 was extraordinary. Gareth Bale's sell-on clause funded a pipeline. Luke Shaw sold to Manchester United for $30 million, Ricky Lambert, Adam Lallana, Nathaniel Clyne all moved for significant fees, and Southampton kept finishing in the top half of the Premier League. They weren't losing. They were operating a model. And this brings me to something I find genuinely fascinating about the financial architecture of player sales. The sell-on clause. Because the story of a transfer doesn't always end when the player leaves. When a club sells a player, they will often negotiate a sell-on clause into the deal. This means that when the buying club eventually sells that player on to a third club, the original selling club receives a percentage of the profit or the total fee. It is essentially a royalty on the player's future value. For development clubs, academies, lower league sides, smaller European clubs, this can be genuinely transformational. A non-league club that sold a teenager to a championship side for £100,000 10 years ago might be sitting on a sell-on clause that triggers when that player moves to the Premier League for $30 million. Suddenly, they receive £1.5 million that nobody saw coming. For a club of that size, that changes everything. New facilities, new coaching staff, new players, all from a clause buried in a contract signed a decade earlier. At the elite level, sell-on clauses become a negotiating battleground. Buying clubs resist them. Selling clubs push hard for them. And when they land, when a club has a 10% sell-on a player who moves for $100 million, it can fundamentally change the financial outlook of the selling club without anyone in the media even noticing. Now, I want to end with the thing that nobody really wants to hear, because there is a harder truth underneath all of this. Some clubs are not temporarily selling clubs waiting to become buying clubs. Some clubs are structurally permanently selling clubs. And the reason is not poor ownership or lack of ambition. The reason is the Premier League's broadcast revenue distribution model. The gap between the broadcast revenue received by the top 6 clubs and the revenue received by the bottom 6 is enormous and has been for years. A club finishing 20th receives significantly less than a club finishing first, not because they performed badly, but because the prize money structure is weighted heavily towards final league position. Combine that with the commercial revenue gap, shirt sales, global sponsorship deals, stadium income, and you have a situation where the financial distance between the top of the league and the middle of the league is almost impossible to close through normal means. The only lever a mid-table club has to close that gap meaningfully is player trading. Buy low, develop, sell high, reinvest. Over and over again. Not because they want to, but because the structure of the game leaves them with no other viable path. That notification on your phone in July. Your best player. Gone. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like the club didn't care. But the uncomfortable truth is that, in most cases, the club had very little choice. The financial architecture of modern football made that decision for them a long time before you ever saw the headline. And the 60 million? It went to the wage bill. It went to the debt. It went to the scout, who was already watching the next one. Whether that next one becomes your new favorite player or becomes the next headline that breaks your heart is a story for another transfer window. I'm Chris. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand the other side of this equation, how buying clubs finance the deals that your club keeps feeding, that video is right here. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do. This is exactly the kind of content I make every single month.